Margaret Fuller's ideas provided the underpinning of the suffrage movement. She was really kind of set the stage for how we ought to think about gender and women's rights. And in a certain way, because she died young at age 40 in 1850, Margaret Fuller was a bit forgotten, her intellectual insights forgotten. So those who acquired the vote, they became the history. That's how Margaret Fuller has been left out a little bit, but it's completely unfair.
Here's a woman who, in a sense, lived with this tension between culture and politics, and also a woman whose identity was so much bound up with her as an intellectual, as a thinker. That's what distinguished her. That's why she wasn't like other women and other men.
She was interested, of course, in the woman question, the big question of the era, advocating for women's right to a vocation, right to an education, interested in trying to get women to work cooperatively to help one another.
Somebody with great political urgency, a sense of engagement with the world, engagement with what the United States could be, a sense of honesty about its shortcomings and also its potential.
Welcome to the Literary Hangover. I'm your host, Matt Leck. With me, Alex Guns.
Hello.
And Grace Jackson.
Hi.
And today we are talking about Margaret Fuller, who's the best person we've covered, I think, so far. What do you guys think?
Let's see. The best person we've covered so far.
So in my power rankings... And
are we including Orwell in that?
That's the thing is... Hold on, I want to make sure.
That's tough. Fuller versus Orwell. That's a hard bracket.
Yeah, so among the American authors, I think above Cooper, above Irving, above...
Oh, she pisses
Poe.
all over Hawthorne.
Oh, yeah, she does.
For sure.
And his wife.
Yeah. Longfellow.
Easy.
Yeah.
That was like a exploration of mediocrity. Longfellow.
Yeah. So this is... And Margaret Fuller was not... she said Longfellow was a master at sort of mimicry.
Oh, yeah. She was quite kind of dismissive of him.
She wasn't as bad as Poe when it comes to the poison penness, but she would go after people.
And didn't Poe kind of like her? He rated her...
Well, we'll get to Poe. We'll get to him right now. Basically what Poe said was, no other woman on earth could write woman in the 19th century. Which is a bit of a... Yeah, it's like, okay, that seems like it's saying something nice about Fuller, but really he's down saying women can't write, basically.
Oh, God, that's awkward.
Like, she's the exception. And actually, Fuller herself sort of occasionally throughout life would feel that way herself a little bit. Actually, we'll get to him later, but in the conversations... she's sometimes upset that the participants can't transcend to higher sort of types of conversation that like she can.
Yeah.
Well, there was that constant refrain throughout her life that people would think that she was so great, partly because she thinks and speaks like a man in scare quotations, you know.
Yeah, well, let's get to her timeline a little bit. Well, in 1638, her patriarchal ancestor arrives in Cambridge, Massachusetts. That's Thomas Fuller. Sarah Margaret Fuller, our protagonist today, was born in 1810 in Cambridgeport, Massachusetts, to Timothy Fuller. Timothy was for Margaret Fuller's life, was a politician, first in the Massachusetts Senate, then in the House of Representatives. He was hoping to get an ambassadorship gig after that, and it didn't work out. Tough stuff. And then he became a sort of farmer, and then that's where he died. And
a gentleman farmer.
A gentleman farmer, who was maybe... term. Yeah, and he might have underestimated the type of labor that farming requires.
It pretty much installed his children to do most of the work, right? He couldn't hire any kind of laborer.
Right.
And after he died, I think Margaret inherited the one cow that was left from the farm, and she gave it to Brook Farm.
Is that where that cow came from?
Fact, I think.
Yeah.
Where has that damn cow even come from?
So Brook Farm, it was a utopian community that Fuller she would occasionally visit and lecture at, but she was never really a part of, even though she was invited to be a part of. And she gave them a cow, and which Nathaniel Hawthorne called in a letter to his wife, the transcendental heifer. That's fractious and apt to kick over the milk pail. And that is hardly the worst thing that Nathaniel Hawthorne said about Margaret Fuller, but we should also maybe save that. I got some timeline stuff here. 1813, that's when Father Timothy joined the Massachusetts Senate. 1814, at the age of 4, is when Sarah Margaret Fuller's education begins. Her father wants to give her an education that a boy would receive in preparation for going to Harvard. What did you guys think about the educational stuff of Fuller?
There was a certain amount of kind of vicariousness in Timothy Fuller's approach to his daughter's education. And what struck me was, from reading her biography, was that after he died, like eventually she remembered him as somebody who had never been quite fulfilled himself. Like he had always had his ambitions thwarted in some way, whether in the Senate or like afterwards when he became a farmer, and he kind of was pretty ill prepared for that. So the way I read that was, you know, that during her early life when he was educating her and just being completely merciless when it came to drilling her, like there was this anecdote about how he insisted that she would stay up late enough so that when he got back from work, he could drill her on Latin and Greek and stuff.
Yeah. The Latin and Greek, and especially like the sort of classical education she gets, she's that and not Christian, right? Like that's her cultural background.
Yeah.
She says towards the end of her life that there are very few times she even made a pretense of appearing as a Christian.
Matt, I think there was also something to be said about the fact that it was only when he realized that he had a very talented child on his hands that he did invest those resources in educating her to that extent. And I think she was by far and away the most brilliant of like all the children of the Fuller household, and he recognized that in her.
And it's interesting her relationship with her father. Apparently he was very cold with her. So basically she goes to different sort of prep schools in her teens. And in 1835, when she's done, moves back in. This is after her father's out of politics and on the farm. Her father dies, but not before he tells her that she doesn't have any faults. She might have some defects, but she has no faults. And that's somehow a big relief to her that he would say that.
Yeah, that reminded me of my secondary school history teacher who never gave A's as a matter of principle. And I once got like a B+, and I felt so goddamn accomplished.
And it's during her teenage years, she's lived in Groton for a little bit, and this is her mid to early teens. But she has a kind of an Orwellian interest in the downtrodden. And at one point, she pays a visit to a woman who apparently is in agony from tuberculosis, only to find out that actually she attempted an abortion, and later she died from that. And that was one of the early sort of run-ins with somebody that affected Fuller's politics.
Yeah, and you see that play out throughout her life when she really takes up the cause of like sex workers and women who are working in factories in Manchester when she visits England. Like I think that's very formative, that experience.
Yeah, it reminds me actually of Orwell in the sort of down and out in Paris and London and Road to Wigan Pier sort of mode.
And the journalistic impulse as well.
But a very activist journalistic impulse too.
Yeah, she's quick to frame childbearing and undermarriage as like a form of slavery, like relating it directly to the slavery that's happening in America at the time. It was her father who gave her a copy of Vindication of the Rights of Women.
Yes.
But ambivalently, right?
Yeah.
Didn't he agonize over whether to do that?
Yeah, it's a weird sort of push-pull. He felt weird about that, even though he was also a bit of an enthusiast for it, sharing with the women in his life.
It's kind of the paradox of him as a person. He's like both domineering but also liberating.
Yeah.
Domineering in his ability to like force her to learn beyond the scope of the world that she lives in.
And I think there was also a suggestion that he was maybe a little bit inclined towards flirtation or more with younger women, like when he was away in Washington on his duties.
Yeah.
He wasn't totally faithful.
It's weird that a politician would do something like that.
Yeah.
That must have been the one and only time that's happened.
Yeah, exactly.
But interestingly, his wife, Margaret Fuller's mother, did push back against that. And that was in the Marshall biography that I read. That was kind of interesting. She, especially in her later years, would kind of give as good as she got with him.
Oh, interesting.
When it came to that, yeah.
So yeah, after her father dies, she goes to Concord, joins the Transcendentalists a little bit, lives with Emerson, has a sort of weird relationship with Emerson.
So weird.
She has weird relationships with both Emerson and Hawthorne.
Yeah.
To name just two. And
yeah.
And then she also meets Bronson Alcott, who's very interesting.
Turns out he's quite the weirdo.
Quite a strange guy. So he gets in trouble for having the school that Margaret herself teaches at for briefly, trying to make ends meet, where it's basically just talking to kids about the
birds and the bees.
Well, and about the divinity of Jesus Christ, which is not like that upset some people, turns out, and he became a very controversial figure, and would later, like these once we get to the 1840s, I think he's one of these utopian figures. But so she, but the one thing that she did get, and we'll bring in the first reference here, from one thing she got from Bronson Alcott, which is after that school fell apart, Bronson Alcott started, he became a conversationalist professionally. And this is a model that Fuller takes up to basically put the first big thing on her resume. Like up until then, her intellectual interest was in Goethe. She wanted to be his biographer, but she had a tough time doing that from America. And when her father died, it meant her ambitions to go to Europe to follow up that study fell through. So.
And I think another important piece of context is just to note that she always needed to make money. Like she's not a trust fund kid.
That's a good point.
The conversations were kind of born out of a need for her to monetize some of her talents. And when her father died, she was made the de facto head of the household, and so she had to find ways to make money.
Yeah, like a lot of the writers, like Irving, Cooper, Hawthorne, she was upper middle class, but on the downward slope of it. Yeah. Unlike Poe, who was his parents were just were actors, so he was not from any sort of wealth. But it does seem to be an impulse, and we talked about this with, and we'll talk about this more with James Fenimore Cooper as we move back into his work. Is there's an impulse among these educated children of families that are on the downward slide. Wilde also, Oscar Wilde, go to try to make in culture what they can no longer make with property. Right, that you can no longer form the world with your property, so you form it through using culture.
I think Goethe is like the first example in her life of someone that she like devours as much as she can and becomes obsessed. Even think her own words is she loses herself like in his spirit, and then transcends it. And I think that's going to be something that she continues to do throughout her life, which is like absolutely fixate and obsess on like a series of ideas or a person until she's emptied the vessel.
Yeah, and is it, I can't remember, but wasn't there someone with Goethe about a mistress, or he was keeping a woman secretly, or there's some sort of scandal that helped her like sort of scandalized her off of him. But I could put a pin in that, maybe come back to it.
She certainly outgrew the Transcendentalists, and that's kind of a fascinating trajectory.
Well, that's the best thing about her. Is I don't know if I've already said this in this episode yet, but I prepared to say it, so even if I've already said it. She transcended the Transcendentalists.
Oh, shit.
She did. That's what she did. But before she transcended them, she got some good ideas of how to market herself as a conversationalist from them. So let's go to, this is from The Lives of Margaret Fuller. This is a biography by John Matson.
There's a great review of that in The Nation, by the way, by Vivian Gornick.
Of the Matson one?
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. I need to check that out.
Yeah, that's great.
Fortunately, at the same time that she was bruising herself against the barriers she encountered in love and friendship, Fuller was preparing herself for greater success in a direction where all the walls had always been easier to climb. She was finding new ways to use her intellect and erudition to inform and inspire others. Some of her own inspiration in this line came from Bronson Alcott, who, since his Temple School debacle, had been giving public conversations as a way to eke out a living. In March 1839, Alcott had described his work to his aged mother. "I am living rather by talking now than by school, and shall be able, by and by, I think, to live this way entirely. I meet circles of 30, 40, or more persons for 10 or 12 evenings, and hold conversation on great subjects with them. Only think of your bashful, silent boy getting bold all at once and going about to talk and make talk." Actually, Alcott had not gotten bold all at once. He had been giving conversations in Boston since 1835. In August 1839, Fuller decided to follow Alcott's model. On the 26th, she met with Alcott to discuss her plan. The next day, Fuller announced to Sophia Ripley that she had decided to become a conversationalist. The genre of the conversation differed importantly from the lecture. First, it involved less detailed preparation. The converser announced the topic of conversation in advance, but used no notes. The artistry of the event depended at least on the appearance of spontaneity. Second, the atmosphere was meant to be more intimate than a public oration. A good-sized parlor supplied a better venue than a formal hall. Moreover, though Alcott often felt forced to dominate his discussions more than he would have liked, the ideal conversation was, as the name indicates, participatory. The leader's goal was not only to inform, but also to inspire listeners to offer their own reflections on the topic. Finally, the conversation was conceived as a vehicle for social and spiritual reform. Alcott regarded his work as a ministry of talking, calculated to bring participants into sympathetic communion around a shared idea. Fuller's ambitions in conducting her own series of conversations were generally similar, but vitally different in their specifics. Alcott's conversations were open to both men and women. Fuller, to the contrary, chose from the outset to speak only to an assembly of women. In a letter to Sophia Ripley, Fuller offered the incomplete outlines of a manifesto. Her hope, she said, was to supply a point of union to well-educated and thinking women in a city which, with great pretensions to mental refinement, boasts at present nothing of the kind, and where I have heard many of a mature age wish for some such means of stimulus and cheer. She was eager to provide a place where they could state their doubts and difficulties with hope of gaining aid from the experience or aspirations of others. It is noteworthy that, in this informal prospectus, Fuller mentioned the need to create a nexus for shared emotional support long before she moved on to her intellectual aspirations for the venture. As she freely admitted, her choice of topics for discussion mattered less than the experience of each that might be brought to bear upon all. Yet she desired much more than to establish a morally supportive sisterhood. At the center of her ambition lay three principles of action: to pass in review the departments of thought and knowledge and endeavor to place them in due relation to one another in our minds, to systematize thought and give a precision in which our sex are so deficient, chiefly, I think, because they have so few inducements to test and classify what they receive, to ascertain what pursuits are best suited to us in our time and state of society, and how we may make best use of our means for building up the life of thought upon the life of action. Without the last of these three objectives, Fuller's plan would have held far less meaning for her. She wanted to lead her circle of well-read women to answer what she referred to as the great questions that few women took time to ask themselves until their best years had flown by. What were we born to do? How shall we do it?
I have some more details on these conversations. So this was fall 1839 when they started. 25 women were at the first meeting. A whole bunch of big names of, especially Horace Greeley's wife was there. Some of the Peabody sisters, except Mary, but it was at her, first ones were in her parlor because she was away teaching. The Greeley connection is how she eventually ends up working for the New York Tribune, one of the ways. The first meeting was at 11 a.m. on a Wednesday. It was on Wednesday mornings because Emerson was doing talks in the Masonic Lodge in the evenings on Wednesday. $10 for 2 meetings for a week.
That seems premium.
Yeah. Elizabeth Cady Stanton called them the vindication of the woman's right to think. And basically this would lead into her arguments in the Great Lawsuit and Women in the 19th Century.
I think it's interesting that she wanted it to be an exclusively female event, partly because in Women in the 19th Century, her kind of the kind of call to action at the end of the book is that women have to get together, they have to have solidarity with each other and help themselves. And actually, what she's asking of men is simply to remove arbitrary obstacles. Mm-hmm. I think she uses that phrase, remove arbitrary barriers. And so the fact that one of her earliest endeavors was to just create a safe space, if you will, for female conversation.
That's really what it sounds like, yeah.
Is, I think, really relevant to everything else she did after that.
Yeah, it's really the can you just let me live of the 19th century.
And also, I think there was an anecdote in the biography I read about how she had participated or had some co-ed conversations at one point, and she got really frustrated because all the men took over, talking about theology.
I think Emerson particularly was an asshole.
Yeah.
I think it was, she was invited to what would be a Transcendentalist meeting while it was still...
Was it the Colosseum Club or something?
It was when the early days of Transcendentalism, when it was largely either pastors or ex-pastors, but they couldn't get past the theology of
Doctrine.
The Trinity or something, and she was pulling her hair out until she just gave up. They always, even though they said they had transcended these dogmatic concepts, the conversation would always diverge into how many angels can you put on the head of a pin and things like that.
Right. Mm-hmm. And so she has this weird relationship with the Transcendentalists, particularly Emerson, who she lives with for a while, with him and his wife. And at one point, her wife says, "I think you've been talking with Emerson." Or Waldo, I guess she might have said. And Fuller's like, yeah, but you put it like that, it sounds so bad. Mm-hmm.
Apparently his study was opposite the guest room on the first floor of his home. Yeah. And so Margaret would be in the guest bedroom and Waldo would be in the study opposite until very late at night, brooding over his books.
Yeah.
No sexual tension at all in that scenario.
And it's funny because ultimately Fuller realizes that Emerson can't love anybody. And then Emerson writes to her after she reaches that realization saying, "Hey, I think I'm in love with someone." And she's this younger girl that's part of the Transcendentalists. Yeah.
Sturgis. Yeah.
That's going to be a common problem with Emerson with most of his relationships. Is he because he's invited to Brook Farm and he's to better understand Transcendentalism. He's I think I'm getting a much better job understanding it in my house. Even pushed Thoreau away eventually.
Well, yeah, we definitely need to do Emerson and Thoreau. But the thing I'm not, two things that I need to follow up on with regards to Emerson, but that I think I know, is one, his first wife died, and then he had such a problem dealing with that he later opened up the coffin months afterwards to look at her corpse. So let me know if that's wrong.
No, that's true. Yeah,
I think that's right. Yeah. And also,
but that was also a common thing to do.
Yeah.
Lincoln did that to his son as well, which is famously portrayed in Lincoln in the Bardo now. But that did really happen.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that.
It's a romantic notion to dig up your loved ones and see them, which never would I do that.
Stop that. Yeah. Then I think he sued the family somehow for some property dispute with his dead wife's family, and that's where a lot of the money for his stuff in Concord came from.
Yes.
But those are two things that I want to follow up on because this isn't an episode about Emerson.
Yeah.
But anyway, so. But they stay close enough to the point where they want to start a magazine for the Transcendentalists, and that would be the Dial. The Transcendentalist magazine, 1840 to 1844. Fuller became the editor, unpaid, in 1839 because Emerson and others didn't really want to take lead on it.
Yeah. The term was coined by Bronson Alcott too, wasn't it?
The Dial, yes, to reference like a sundial, and is to go after new ideas.
Didn't he call it, what was it, like a bold new Bible? It was like a bold Bible for New America or something.
Yeah,
lofty
so
like that.
We'll get into, let's go back to The Lives of Margaret Fuller by John Matson, and where he discusses the founding of this magazine here.
Hedges' qualms aside, the Dial does not look to modern eyes like the brash experiment that it was in its time. Indeed, the magazine's prospectus, most likely written by Ripley, was intentionally mild-mannered. The magazine's purpose, the public was assured, was simply to furnish a medium for the freest expression of thought on the questions which interest earnest minds in every community. Disclaiming any fixed agenda, the Dial promised to discuss principles, not promote causes. It vowed always to preserve an independent mind. In a letter to Channing, though, Fuller sounded like a more partisan note. Without mentioning the Dial by name, she intimated that its constituents had a plain target: the complacent materialism of a money-minded society.
Yeah.
She argued that the consistent prosperity enjoyed by Americans since the Revolution had left the nation's nobler faculties undeveloped. The industrial growth of the country had resulted in a commercial and political fever that had laid waste to the ethical and spiritual nature of its citizens. Education had become superficial, thought had turned vulgar. Americans cared more for getting a living than learning to live mentally and morally. In response, a small minority of New Englanders was now on the rise. Disgusted by the meretricious crudeness of commerce, they had become radicals. Revolted by the materialistic premises of rational religion, they had become mystics. Insofar as these rebels demanded the instant creation of utopia, Fuller disavowed them. Nevertheless, she believed that every noble scheme, every poetic manifestation, prophesies to man his eventual destiny. Only an enlarged sense of the possible, she thought, could rally Americans out of their gluttonous torpor. It is on this ground, she concluded, that I sympathize with what is called the Transcendental Party, and that I feel their aim is to be the true one. Yet, as Fuller knew, even transcendental thought did not insulate her from the indignities of sexual politics.
And here's later in The Lives of Margaret Fuller by Matson, where the Dial comes to a conclusion. Basically, it was Emerson and Thoreau and Fuller and all of them writing it. There's a bunch of Emerson and Thoreau in there chanting the Transcendentalists.
I think Fuller ended up being Thoreau's first publisher in that sense because he was significantly younger. I think she also notes that a third of the poets, at least in the Dial, are from women, which is far and away much larger representation than any other literary journal.
Yeah, even to this day.
It took her a long time to kind of come out as a female editor, though, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
She would sign her pieces with SMF or
F
or...
And the inaugural edition of the Dial said, had a line like, "We wish to meet thinking men."
But the most essential reason was a matter of character. She simply could not devote less than a full measure of energy and passion to the work that mattered to her. Buoyed by assurances from Elizabeth Peabody that compensation was on the way, she stayed on through the winter. Ill much of the time, and continually distracted by the wants of others whenever she seemed to be on the point of satisfying her own. When William Henry Channing pleaded with her to expend herself with less abandon, she rebuffed him curtly. "If I economized," she wrote, "I should be naught." But neither economy of purse nor lavishness of effort could fend off the inevitable crisis. Finally, on St. Patrick's Day in 1842, the last reason to hold on gave way. Until a short time earlier, the moribund Weeks and Jordan had succeeded in withholding documents that contained a devastating secret. Upon reviewing them, Peabody learned the truth. The firm had grossly overstated the Dial's subscriptions. Whereas Fuller and Emerson had blithely believed that they had attracted between 500 and 600 subscribers, the true figure did not top 300. The journal's meager revenue sufficed to cover only operating expenses. There would be nothing left from which to pay Fuller's promised salary, now or ever. For Fuller, nearly 32, it was a bitter discovery, not only because it affected her personal fortunes, but also because it showed how far her country was from accepting the ideas that were life itself to her and her friends. First at the Temple School, and now at the Dial, the living waters of Transcendentalism had proved to be, from an economic standpoint, a completely dry well. As soon as the news had sunk in, Fuller took up a sheet of paper and wrote to Emerson. She told him that she had at first hoped to ask only for a suspension of her duties at the Dial. Now, it was impossible for her to continue on any basis. She had suffered a perceptible diminution of strength, and the winter's labor had been so severe that she did not expect to recover fully for 2 or 3 months. Indeed, since the onset of winter, she had been too worn out to write anything other than letters. Looking back, she felt she had never done what she might have for the magazine, though she could have if she had received her promised pay. She thus resigned her editorship. Fuller suggested Theodore Parker to replace her. However, Emerson chose to take up the reins himself, rather than have the journal pass into hands that know not Joseph. He thought he was a poor replacement for her, as he told her. "Nobody is braver and faithful and self-sufficing but you." With deep embarrassment, he apologized for the bankrupt's return she had received on her investment of time, health, and labor. And he forlornly added, "We are all your debtors, and must always be." Emerson was to remain editor until the journal finally expired in April 1844. However, when he wrote to Hedge the week after Margaret's resignation, he sounded as if the magazine were already dead. "Poor Dial," he exclaimed. "It has not pleased any mortal. No man cried, 'God save it.'" The depressed tone of Emerson's comments on the demise of the Dial makes it easy to assume that the magazine was a failure. A more thoughtful judgment is required. The Dial's 4-year run was actually double the life expectancy of journals of the time, and thanks to Greeley's Tribune, it reached many more readers than the paltry subscription rolls reflected. The Dial's significance can best be measured by what was lost when it ceased to exist. For the Transcendental movement, the death of the Dial meant both the loss of its public voice and the demise of the one forum that could accommodate its diversity and its passionate love of freedom. The eminent historian Henry Steele Commager called the magazine a place for religion without the church, for education without the university, for law without the state. Unable to agree on much of anything, the progressive writers of New England found in the Dial a place where Christian essays, pantheistic short fiction, and pagan poetry were equally welcome, and where difference was an occasion for celebration instead of rancor. The passing of the Dial was also a huge step backward for experimental writing in America.
So yeah, the Dial, pretty cool little magazine that they had there.
There was a funny moment in the Marshall biography where after Emerson takes over the Dial and Fuller writes to him being like, this magazine now is just you and all your friends writing to each other.
Right, yeah.
And at the time, Emerson was working on a edition of Dial whose theme was friendship.
An essay on friendship, I think, came out in the last one.
Yeah, just being seen so clearly.
It's so paradoxical because I feel like there's still some significance to this magazine now, even though at the time they're like, this kind of sucks. Mm-hmm. This is not what we want it to be. People don't come through with what they promised to before it gets started. If it would not exist if it weren't for Fuller, right? And what she did in the first couple of years of it, and it barely did, even despite her impoverishing herself to try to keep it afloat, basically. And it should also be stated, like, being an editor is a certain type of skill. It's not necessarily the one she was even most suited to, right? She's like a conversationalist. Getting and editing other people's works is not really, that's not the same thing. But she still went after it.
I think it's important to keep this in the perspective of the Great Awakening that's happening at this moment, that there are other people on the other side of like the political aisle that also sense this like ennui in the American scene and are looking to capitalize on it in their favor. And you can imagine a different world where transcendentalism or this kind of like more progressive form of discourse would have been as successful as, say, like revival religion. Mm-hmm. Reading the Dial is almost like looking into an alternate history into what America could have been if it caught on.
Like this entire decade, basically the 1840s, is the in What Hath God Wrought, that Oxford series. I don't know who wrote that one, Howe or someone. Howe, yeah. It talks about this as the time of utopian settlements, right? I think the Mormons are at this time. Mm-hmm. Fruitvale is another one tied to the Transcendentalists, which is like a vegetarian commune. Brook Farm, which we should move to now quickly. We talked about a little bit. Fuller provided the cow. It was a commune based on Fourierism and the associationism of Charles Fourier, the French guy who makes an appearance in The House of Seven Gables. Uncle Venner is a bit Fourierism-istic, and so to remind people, Fourier Fourier. I don't know how I want to pronounce it, but he's the guy who thought like we need to have these 1,600 person communes where everybody is able to follow. And I think I might not. I actually think I might be underselling him a little bit. We'll get to. He was an influence on Fuller, so his thinking was out there. Emerson also wrote an essay about him. But anyway, back to Brook Farm. It was in West Roxbury, Massachusetts. Unitarian minister George Ripley announced it to the Transcendental Club in his plans in October 1840. There were 80 communal experiments in the 1840s in the United States. Brook Farm was the first secular one. It was so the Joint Stock Company was formed in October 1841. 10 members. Fuller was invited, visited, never joined, but provided a cow, and this was the cow that Hawthorne said called the Transcendental Heifer. Hawthorne himself was one of the initial investors and inhabitants.
He brought his family too.
Yeah, but he didn't. I think he kept his wife away for a while, or for most of it.
Oh yeah.
But he's like, look at how great it's fun to do work at the beginning. That's not a direct quote. And then at the end, he said the custom house was not so bad. As the thing. And they really, like I said, they were really into Charles Fourier, and they had a birthday party for him once, where somebody proposed a toast to him as the second coming of Christ. Yeah, actually, we'll go to the other biography that came out. Two big Margaret Fuller biographies, both very good, came out in 2013. This one is by Megan Marshall. It's called Margaret Fuller, A New American Life.
Now all seems fermenting to a new state. Margaret had boasted to Carrie Sturgis of her conversations for women early in 1840. The same could be said of her numerous schemes for reform or innovation that gained momentum in Boston during the century's fourth decade. The city of nearly 100,000 residents had been quick to recover from the 1837 financial panic and had suffered less than other mercantile centers on the eastern seaboard, its conservative banking industry reaping a rare reward in comparison to financial institutions in New York and Philadelphia, and securing Boston's place for the moment as the leading port of its size in the Union. The new prosperity seemed only to abet visionary plans born of the darker days, when Waldo had asked in his journal, shortly after delivering his incendiary divinity school address, "Is it not better to live in revolution than to live in dead times?" Boston in the 1840s was, in Margaret's view, a locus of dissonance, of transition, of aspiration, where no three persons think alike. The fall of 1840 brought dreamers of all stripes together at Boston's Chardon Street Chapel, a plain-timbered, steepleless house of worship, newly built by Millerite Adventists at the foot of Beacon Hill, for a November meeting of the Friends of Universal Reform. The abolitionists William Lloyd Garrison and Maria Chapman were there, along with liberal religion's gray eminence, Reverend Channing, the young firebrand Theodore Parker, Waldo, and Margaret. Chagrined when a turbulent discussion snagged once again on a question of church reform, how best to observe the Sabbath, Margaret declared the meeting a total failure in a letter to William Channing, who'd resigned his pulpit in Cincinnati and was contemplating a move to Brook Farm, or possibly to an association of his own design in western Massachusetts. "I will not write to you of these conventions and communities unless they bear better fruit," she promised him. "We are not ripe to reconstruct society yet." Still, like William and others at the convention, Margaret believed that one thing seems sure: many persons will soon, somehow, somewhere, throw off a part, at least, of these terrible weights of the social contract. Just what Margaret's role in the rebellion would be, if any, remained unclear. She was as capable as any of the communitarians at arguing the difference between living and getting a living. To William she confessed that if she had a firmer hold on life, that is, had the money to invest in a share of a communal property, she might be inclined to sign on. But when George and Sarah Ripley traveled to Concord in a campaign to enroll Waldo in their experiment at Brook Farm, inviting Margaret and Bronson Alcott along for a hearing, Margaret held back. "The Phalanx talk was useless," she reported afterward to Carey, "except in helping her make up her mind to abstain."
The phalanx, that's an element of voyeurism. Divide society into these phalanxes.
"The Phalanx talk was useless," she reported afterward to Carey, "except in helping her make up her mind to abstain." Margaret published 2 long essays endorsing the Brook farmers' aims in successive issues of the Dial, written by Elizabeth Peabody, who shared Margaret's preference for city life over rural confraternity, yet had opened her book room at West Street for the planning sessions of the Ripleys and their friends, men and women, who have dared to say to one another, "Why not begin to move the mountain of custom and convention?" Margaret sent Lloyd to school at Brook Farm and recommended the community to William Channing and to her Rhode Island friend Charles Newcomb, who boarded there for several months. She visited often enough to have a room in the communal hive designated as her own. But given what she'd learned of the limitations of human nature from one particular group of individuals, Margaret had come to believe that utopia is impossible to build up on Earth.
Now, she'll come to maybe revise that a little bit when she gets to Europe. Now, that Brook Farm is what Hawthorne based the Blithedale romance on, and I think we might actually have to do that one, too.
Yeah.
Is there a character in that that's loosely based on Fuller?
Yeah, I think it's Zenobia, or let me look that up.
Zenobia.
Yeah, Zenobia. And actually, we can go into a bit of Hawthorne nastiness here.
Hawthorne bashing.
Fuller and Hawthorne did get along fairly well, and there was a point where they were even spending a lot of time in Concord together, having talks and stuff. Where actually Emerson got jealous, I think, at one point of them. But this is from Brenda Wineapple's biography of Hawthorne. So basically, Hawthorne might have been upset that Fuller. She was sort of lukewarm about Twice Told Tales, said that Hawthorne intimates and suggests, but he does not lay bare the mysteries of our being, that his style was placid and his command of language indolent.
It's a fair criticism.
It's a very restrained criticism, to be fair.
Yeah.
Yeah, it didn't uncover the truth of the universe.
And Wineapple writes, 8 years after Fuller's premature death, Hawthorne retaliated with vitriolic pleasure. Writing in his notebooks in 1858, he characterized his former friend as quote, as lacking, quote, the charm of womanhood, and a humbug.
Shameless.
Yeah.
She's dead.
And a humbug, talented, yes, but arrogantly determined to, quote, make herself the greatest, wisest, best woman of the age. And to that end, she set to work on her strong, heavy, unpliable, and, in many respects, defective and evil nature,
Oh, God.
and adorned it with a mosaic of admirable qualities, such as she chose to possess.
Unbelievable.
And he used her spirit as an inspiration for Hester Prynne in The Scarlet Letter. A lot of Hester's more liberal and forward-thinking ideas are inspired by women in the 19th century.
And I think she had a bit of a run-in with Hawthorne's wife, Sophia, right?
Yeah.
I think in The Great Lawsuit, which was the essay that was the sort of germ of women in the 19th century, she has quite a strident critique of marriage, and Sophia Hawthorne came back to her saying, like, well, actually, you know, if you were actually married, Margaret, you would have the credibility to make this critique.
Yeah, you can't really say anything.
That's such a killer argument. I love that. Just being like, oh, you think it's a institution that enslaves women? Well, why don't you put on some shackles? And maybe you tell me.
That's like the sports press conference. Like, oh, you think a 98-mile-an-hour fastball is easy to hit? Why don't you get in the batters box?
Yeah.
So The Great Lawsuit, I think it seems to me like maybe the best thing Dial ever published. This was published in 1843 after she was done being the editor. And like you said, later expanded into Women in the 19th Century. Lydia Maria Child, who studied and sort of mentored a little bit Fuller earlier in life. She's also a writer. She wrote Hobomok, one of the first, even preceded, I think, Last of the Mohicans, and maybe did. It was definitely before Sedgwick and Hope Leslie. And then she later wrote an abolitionist argument. But she told Fuller that The Great Lawsuit was there's too much furniture in her rooms, meaning way too many allusions and references to like classical thought and biblical thought and all this different stuff, which I think is. We can maybe move on to a Woman in the 19th Century now, actually, just to, I guess, to zoom through the chronology a little bit.
I think that criticism is absolutely correct, but it happens to be one of the charms, I think, of the work, that it's like a vortex of information. And it's so smart that it doesn't have chapters or any kind of... There is order to it, but not any order that is easily understood. It's just this like whirlwind of information that you're supposed to like grasp this totality of this vision that this writer has.
Yeah, so basically, she publishes a great lawsuit in the Dial in 1843, and that's also a big year for her because she travels to Illinois and Wisconsin and writes Summer on the Lakes, which we won't discuss too much, but it's basically a sort of strangely Joyceanly structured journey through to the Great Lakes, where she actually sees Native Americans for the first time
and interacts with them.
Yeah, and it's interesting because apparently in that she'll talk about how this is my interaction with these Native Americans, and then she'll retreat to talking about like this writer says this about Native Americans. It's like, no, you have your experience, just go with that. But she still needs to like basically live it through text almost.
There was a cool anecdote in the Marshall biography about how there was like a crazy storm one day and she sheltered in the hut of like a Native American woman and actually was using sign language to communicate with her because they didn't have a common language.
Right.
And that was that made a big impact on her.
Yeah, and when she gets back to Massachusetts, she becomes the first woman to access the Harvard Library in research for it. Yeah.
And apparently all of the young Harvard men were just like ogling this strange creature among them for the first time.
And she would have been how old at that point? She would have been...
like 29 or 30, maybe.
1843, and she's 1810, right?
33.
Yeah, she'd been 33. Then she publishes Summer on the Lakes. It's called by one reviewer as like the only legit American book this year, but it sells okay, but not great.
Wasn't it also illustrated?
Oh, I'm not sure if it was or not.
I think it came with illustrations.
And then she accepts Horace Greeley's offer to write basically front page columns for him and opinion articles.
And to move to New York.
Yeah, to move to New York.
Big move.
Yeah, literary society here.
Yeah. Finally got out of the backwoods of the quote-unquote intelligentsia in Boston and into a real metropolitan center of learning.
But it's so interesting that in New York she feels like she's left America's like intellectual center of gravity is still in Boston.
Yeah.
But America's like commercial and I guess social engine is New York.
Right.
Yeah, America's Athens, as Jefferson referred to Boston.
I think she just needed to get away from Emerson, basically.
Oh, yeah. She also...
It's too much.
A lot of this there's a definite, like, romantic trials and tribulations that are underlying a lot of... Like, she's going through shit when she's, like, producing works and stuff like that. It's very interesting.
I think Marshall is, like, good enough... Or seems to hint at that there was some sort of, like, attempt to recreate her relationship... her difficult relationship with her father.
Marshall's not the only person to say that. She's explicit about that with Emerson. Like, I'm looking for a father figure sort of thing. And I think she finally outgrows that a bit with Osoli, who she ends up having a child with, because she's like way intellectually his superior.
And they don't have a common language either. Literally, like
right.
Only body language happening there.
Yeah, the universal language, body language.
I'm going to go back to this Interlock Media article a bit on her time at the New York Tribune. Oh, and we also get a bit of a Harriet Martineau's critique of the Conversations.
Still the law of the land. Anything they were seen as elitist and as maybe a waste of time. Especially by some abolitionists. Harriet Martineau, the British abolitionist, she had been a friend of Fuller's, and when she had visited the United States on one of her trips, Fuller was in the midst of conducting her conversations, and years later when Martineau wrote her autobiography, she sort of famously critiqued Fuller and her other conversation attendees for talking about the arts and literature when at the same time slavery was still the law of the land. They should have been doing something actively towards, working to abolish slavery rather than sitting around gorgeously dressed, as she said.
She wanted to do something very different, to break out of Concord, of Boston. Seemed as though she was done. She was ready to move on.
She had an invitation to be the front page columnist for Horace Greeley's New York Tribune.
Most of her friends were skeptical about her opportunities to advance critical thinking and intellectual culture through a medium that was as popular and as often sensationalist as newspapers then. She thought she saw opportunity.
While she's working for the Tribune, she's interested not only in literary criticism, but also in starting to write about the social conditions in the city, and traveling and visiting insane asylums, if you will, and visiting prisons. And so, in fact, when she goes to Sing Sing prison, to the women's prison there, she actually holds her conversations.
Margaret Fuller's involvement with the women prisoners at Sing Sing was really quite pivotal for her. In fact, she would later write in Women in the 19th Century, there was nothing different between the woman who powders her hair in the boudoir and the streetwalker. In fact, she found the streetwalker to be more credible, more genuine, more honest.
She also spoke out against, in the pages of the Tribune, the war with Mexico and Texas, and even Texas.
We'll get to the war with Mexico and Texas a bit later, but as hinted there, the Sing Sing experience played a big role leading up to her writing of Women in the 19th Century, basically extrapolating from the Great Lawsuit. And I don't know if we've stressed this enough, is the reason she talks about mythological figures and from Greek mythology and biblical mythology and so whatever is she wants to highlight female role models. Like, these are women that are doing things that are supposedly masculine through our lens, but if you look at them in different cultural contexts, then you can see that actually these attributes aren't exclusive to men, for instance. And in a certain way, that's what we're doing here, but just the model is to reveal those figures in history in a light that society as it is now would maybe obscure.
Yeah, like to dig up a lineage that no one's bothered to connect yet.
Right.
And I also think that she's using those examples to serve another kind of rhetorical purpose, which is that she's very interested in universal values. And I was struck reading Women in the 19th Century by the extent to which she's basically formulating a theory of universal human rights 100 years before the Declaration of Human Rights was signed. And I think at one point she even uses that phrase. And so I think when she's pointing at these like classical models, what she's also saying is this is timeless. Like, human perfectibility is something that has always been on the table and always will be on the table.
Right.
Yeah. I think that's one of her great strengths, is that she ties the concept of women's liberation as both this kind of new and bold concept, but then, like you said, Grace, like steeps it in this tradition, is to say that she's smart enough to look back and say, like, this struggle has been going on since, like, people have been writing down myths to explain themselves. And so, like, it's like, I'm just one more link in the chain that will lead us to utopia.
And this might also be something that, the one part of the transcendentalist experience that she retains is this idea of universality of experience and virtue and morality and so on.
I think of like the idea of like the importance of revolution also. I think is something that she took much further than the transcendentalist, but like that transcendentalist like theme of like a revolution is good because it allows the present moment and the past to face each other and look each other in the eye. And I think Margaret Fuller is someone who took that very seriously in a way that the people who may have wrote it did not.
And basically lived it when she went to Europe later.
Yeah, so I want to play this once again from John Matson's The Lives of Margaret Fuller. And this is on the women in the 19th century.
Fuller saved for her closing pages the lines that were to become the signature statement of her book. But if you ask me what offices they, women, may fill, I reply, any. I do not care what case you put. Let them be sea captains, if you will. The writing of Women in the 19th Century and the experiences that had inspired it marked a turning point in Fuller's thinking. As a younger woman, she had never been political by nature. Indeed, her lack of interest in public affairs had elicited some of her father's most scalding criticism. her preferred solutions had always been cerebral. The key to life had always lain in the evolution and reform of one's inner consciousness. Fuller still believed in the primacy of one's inner world. However, as her revisions of The Great Lawsuit made clear, she was more conscious than before of the ways in which the real world could thwart one's yearnings for perfection. Toward the end of Woman in the 19th Century, using the masculine noun, but clearly speaking of all humankind, Fuller observed, "To address man wisely, you must not forget that his life is partly animal, subject to the same laws with nature. But you cannot address him wisely unless you consider him still more as a soul, and appreciate the conditions and destiny of soul." Fuller's meditations on the imprisonment of the human soul had led her to realize that the spirit could not be separated from the life of the body, or from life in society. Her visits to Sing Sing had reminded her that poverty and physical abuse and neglect can destroy a soul as efficiently as any more metaphysical devil. The ends that she now proposed were to be attained not solely through scholarship or Concord-style philosophizing, but also by society's reform. In Woman in the 19th Century, she evinces the understanding that the spiritual is the social and, as many more in later times would realize, the personal is the political. Her thought was more balanced, practical, and holistic than ever before. Woman in the 19th Century also signaled a more generally significant broadening, one that affected the cause of women's rights as a whole. To the very limited extent that the condition of women had entered the national discussion before Fuller published her book, the controversy had turned principally on questions of law: the right of married women to own property, the right to divorce and to have custody of children, and, in extremely radical circles, the right to vote. In their very framing, legal questions tended to emphasize the differences between the sexes. Fuller's argument looked beyond these categories. To a wide audience, Woman in the 19th Century expressed the conviction that the legal issues, though critical to the advancement of women, were only ancillary to a higher objective: the self-realization of human beings, both male and female. Fuller's book made its greatest contribution to women's rights by setting the terms of this self-realization. It called on its audience to recognize that masculine and feminine are fluid classifications, and that talent must be respected and developed without regard to the type of body in which it resides.
That strikes me as sort of a utilitarian the argument. Like we often talk about poverty, right, as through these metrics that seem to be a little bit secondary, like this is how many patents we could be having filed by would-be inventors if we didn't have childhood poverty and undereducate certain groups. So
it's always framed in terms of people's contribution to like the marketplace.
Yeah, and
those refugees could be the next Steve Jobs.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, the entrepreneur refugee trope. That's my favorite.
And I don't think Fuller necessarily we have the luxury of seeing that play out. You know, Fuller's still like, can we let women read? And express themselves in public forums. Oops.
That concept about the having masculine and feminine features is that there's so many writers that are going to touch on that idea. Most notably, at least for me, was Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own. Mm-hmm. She directly touches that, like so much so that it seems clear to me that she must have read this.
Yeah, definitely.
There's a quote I have which is from A Room of One's Own, because I had to go through it because like I've read this before.
Right.
And she says, "And I went on amateurishly to sketch a plan of the soul, so that in each of us 2 powers preside, 1 male, 1 female. And in the man's brain, the man predominates over the woman, and in the woman's brain, the woman predominates over the man.
Right.
The normal and comfortable state of being is that when the two live in harmony together, spiritually cooperating. If one is a man, still the woman part of his brain must have effect, and a woman also must have intercourse with the man in her.
On that as well, I just want to mention, in Women in the 19th Century, and as a Shelley fangirl, I have to quote this, when she's talking about the masculine and feminine kind of like partaking of one another and mingling, she says, I must mention Shelley, who, like all men of genius, shared the feminine development and, unlike many, knew it. Which is just, I think, such a wonderful, like, pithy little sentence. So all men of genius have something of, like, the feminine in them, but only some of them know it. And I just love that.
Yeah.
Did you see in the biography when she described herself as thoroughly Byronized? And she was really inspired of him going off into the War of Greek independence, which is something that she would recreate.
Right, exactly. All right, let's keep going a bit with Matson.
Fuller had taken the great lesson of her conversations to a more visible place. She had invited the women of her nation to seek their highest worth, and she had challenged men to respect them for it. The later, more widely acknowledged founders of the American women's rights movement, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, acknowledged Fuller's inspiration, and Woman in the 19th Century led them to aver that Fuller had possessed more influence on the thought of American women than any woman previous to her time. Carried to the finish line by a final rush of inspiration, Fuller completed the draft of Woman in the 19th Century on November 17, 1844. After a long walk on an exhilarating morning, she sat down to write and marveled as the words kept spinning out beneath her hand until just before 9 in the evening, she was done. At last, she felt she had done something worthy of a small slice of immortality. She wrote to William Henry Channing, I felt a delightful glow, as if I had put a good deal of my true life in it, as if, suppose I went away now, the measure of my footprint would be left on the earth. Her only concern, though it did not much deter her, was her sense that her writing demanded too much culture in the reader to be quickly or extensively diffused. Yet, it probably occurred to her that it had to be so. To claim that women were entitled to civil and economic rights, it was helpful to demonstrate that one woman, at least, was more than the intellectual equal of the sex that already enjoyed them. She hoped that the book, which was somewhat longer than an issue of the Dial, might be out by Christmas. However, although she signed a contract with Greeley's own publishing imprint, Greeley and McElrath, in late November, Woman in the 19th Century did not appear until February 16, 1845. The reception was beyond anything Fuller had dared to imagine. She had told Channing that she hoped it might sell 1,000 copies in a few years' time. The first edition of 1,500 was sold within a week. Though denying that money had been her object, Fuller cheerfully pocketed the $85 that came her way and took her popular success as the most speaking fact about the book, as well as the one that most pleased her. Meanwhile, although conservative reviewers were quick to chastise her perceived radicalism, more moderate voices praised her as a thinking, right-judging person and ranked her achievement with that of the great English rights advocate Mary Wollstonecraft. The book is the theme of all the newspapers and many of the journals, Fuller reported to her brother Eugene. Sweeter still, she was able to add, respect is expressed for me personally. In a letter to Carrie Sturgis, with a mixture of pride and surprise, Fuller reported seeing placards around New York hailing Woman in the 19th Century as the great book of the age. She was, at last, a literary celebrity.
It's pretty exciting.
Yeah.
I think, I can't remember who it was, but mentioned that this is maybe the first major feminist work in English since Wollstonecraft. I guess we can play a few selections from women in the 19th century. There's a great full recording of it done by, of course,
The God,
Elizabeth Klett. Thank you, Elizabeth, the best. She reads this. I guess let's start with the intro. First, 3.5 minutes, just to get a sense of where she's going, what kind of writing Fuller is. There was a joke at the Brook Farm where they said we read Dante in the original German. I can't remember who the other one was. Dante in the original Italian and Margaret Fuller
in the German.
Yeah, or was it Goethe? And Dante in the Italian and Margaret Fuller in the English. And I mean that's mainly because she does a lot of like untranslated selections from other languages and stuff like that, which is awesome. Love that stuff because as a person who barely speaks. Who speaks like remedial Spanish and French? Just throw some Latin and German in.
Yeah.
I guess I just won't know what this says.
And yet somehow when she does it, it's like so much easier to cope with than when Henry James does it.
Oh yeah.
I don't know. There's just something about.
well, it's so stylized. It's like her jumping around for me is like part of the pleasure of reading it, of being like, oh, let's talk about this Orphic legend. Actually, let's talk about Christ. Actually, here's a Latin poem really quick.
Yeah. I also think that she's basically, whenever she writes, she is modeling the kind of citizen that she thinks America needs. So, like, you can kind of read her whole career as an attempt to raise the standards. Like, everywhere she's talking about, like, you know, we should have higher standards for like women's education. We should expect more of men. We shouldn't just dismiss men as like having these desires that leads to a demand for like prostitution and stuff. Her whole thing is like, we have to be better.
Right.
Yeah, I definitely think she saw herself as unique, like uniquely intellectual, but not in a way that other people couldn't overcome.
Not exclusive.
She was very democratic in that sense, where she really felt that like, I could do this. Anyone can do what I can do. You just have to put in the time.
Yeah, and she also like recognized her father's role in that too.
Yeah.
She wrote a couple different things with different sort of emotional responses to it. One sort of like classically dark romantic. This is the father. It's like the father in a Bronte novel or something like that. Like very awful, which in no doubt partially true. But also she wrote things saying like it's good that he thought to took such a interest in educating his daughter. So here's from Elizabeth Klett's recording. And we're not going to play too much from this, but I recommend it. People listen to it. It's a good listen. It's probably a better listen than it is a better read, frankly.
All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. Woman in the 19th Century, and Kindred Papers Relating to the Sphere, Condition, and Duties of Women. By Margaret Fuller. Woman in the 19th Century, Part 1. Preface to Woman in the 19th Century. The following essay is a reproduction, modified and expanded, of an article published in the Dial, Boston, July 1843, under the title of The Great Lawsuit, Man versus Men, Woman versus Women. This article excited a good deal of sympathy, and still more interest. It is in compliance with wishes expressed from many quarters that it is prepared for publication in its present form. Objections having been made to the former title as not sufficiently easy to be understood, the present has been substituted as expressive of the main purpose of the essay, though by myself the other is preferred, partly for the reason others do not like it, that is, that it requires some thought to see what it means, and might thus prepare the reader to meet me on my own ground. Besides, it offers a larger scope, and is in that way more just to my desire. I meant by that title to intimate the fact that, while it is the destiny of man in the course of the ages to ascertain and fulfil the law of his being, so that his life shall be seen as a whole to be that of an angel or messenger, the action of prejudices and passions which attend in the day the growth of the individual is continually obstructing the holy work that is to make the earth a part of heaven. By man I mean both man and woman, These are the two halves of one thought. I lay no especial stress on the welfare of either. I believe that the development of the one cannot be effected without that of the other. My highest wish is that this truth should be distinctly and rationally apprehended, and the conditions of life and freedom recognized as the same for the daughters and the sons of time, twin exponents of a divine thought. I solicit a sincere and patient attention from those who open the following pages at all. I solicit of women that they will lay it to heart to ascertain what is for them the liberty of law. It is for this, and not for any the largest extension of partial privileges, that I seek. I ask them, if interested by these suggestions, to search their own experience and intuitions for better, and fill up with fit materials the trenches that hedge them in. From men I ask a noble and earnest attention to anything that can be offered on this great and still obscure subject, such as I have met from many with whom I stand in private relations. And may truth, unpolluted by prejudice, vanity, or selfishness, be granted daily more and more as the due of inheritance, and only valuable conquest for us all. November 1844. Woman in the 19th century. Frailty, thy name is woman. The earth waits for her queen. The connection between these quotations may not be obvious, but it is strict. Yet would any contradict us if we made them applicable to the other side, and began also...
So yeah, Margaret launches right into sort of deconstruction of literature, basically.
Mm-hmm. I guess just to note the ambitiousness of the work from the outset, like her preface is very self-conscious in that respect, and I think that you see, even with the title of the work, Woman in the 19th Century, that she is acutely aware of her place in history. She has this historical consciousness of progress and time that is very distinctive.
Yeah, it's funny how closely it parallels Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century.
Oh, yeah.
Like they're both sort of like, I think probably the same sort of self-consciously grandiose, this is my magnum opus sort of thing.
Yeah, and I love how even in the opening, how she plays around with concepts of genre, because it's not going to be a straight journalistic piece, and it's not going to be so much like a philosophical inquiry, and it's not going to be a sermon, but yet like it is all of these things. And there's like adages in there too, like these brilliant little diamonds.
Right.
And she just kind of effortlessly, I don't know. We'll figure something out about that.
You want to take another run?
Effortlessly. No, I can't do it.
Effortlessly?
Without effort.
All right, well, I guess I'll have a stroke in about 10 minutes. But she weaves these in and out, and I think that's a very transcendental thing to do. Or it's something that she picked up and astutely used from her contemporaries.
Right.
Another thing to note is her relentless optimism. Like,
yes.
For all of her... She can be quite biting and quite cutting with her social commentary, but ultimately she is animated by this belief that things are going to get better and progress is possible.
And it's very enlightenment-centric. Like, she talks about different types of attaining wisdom and how you do that through going through the world. And talk about her biting criticism. She really starts to heat up towards the end of part one here, and so let's go to that.
That flowed when such crimes were committed in her name. Yes, man, born to purify and animate the unintelligent and the cold, can in his madness degrade and pollute no less the fair and the chaste. Yet truth was prophesied in the ravings of that hideous fever, caused by long ignorance and abuse. Europe is conning a valued lesson from the blood-stained page. The same tendencies, further unfolded, will bear good fruit in this country. Yet by men in this country, as by the Jews when Moses was leading them to the promised land, everything has been done that inherited depravity could do to hinder...
So that parallel with Moses leading Jews to the promised land is something Americans are very conscious of as they're settling the country.
Mm-hmm.
...hinder the promise of heaven from its fulfillment. The cross, here as elsewhere, has been planted only to be blasphemed by cruelty and fraud. The name of the Prince of Peace has been profaned by all kinds of injustice towards the Gentile whom he said he came to save. But I need not speak of what has been done towards the red man, the black man. Those deeds are the scoff of the world, and they have been accompanied by such pious words that the gentlest would not dare to intercede with, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Here, as elsewhere, the gain of creation consists always in the growth of individual minds, which live and aspire as flowers bloom and birds sing in the midst of morasses, and in the continual development of that thought, the thought of human destiny, which is given to eternity adequately to express, and which ages of failure only seemingly impede. Only seemingly. And whatever seems to the contrary, this country is as surely destined to elucidate a great moral law as Europe was to promote the mental culture of man. Though the national independence be blurred by the servility of individuals, though freedom and equality have been proclaimed only to leave room for a monstrous display of slave-dealing and slave-keeping, though the free American so often feels himself free, like the Roman, only to pamper his appetites, end his indolence through the misery of his fellow beings, still it is not in vain that the verbal statement has been made, all men are born free and equal. There it stands, a golden certainty wherewith to encourage the good, to shame the bad. The New World may be called clearly to perceive that it incurs the utmost penalty if it reject or oppress the sorrowful brother. And if men are deaf, the angels hear. But men cannot be deaf. It is inevitable that an external freedom, an independence of the encroachments of other men, such has been achieved for the nation, should be so also for every member of it. That which has once been clearly conceived in the intelligence cannot fail, sooner or later, to be acted out. It has become a law as irrevocable as that of the Medes in their ancient dominion. Men will privately sin against it, but the law, as expressed by a leading mind of the age, tutti fatti a semblanza d'un solo, fili tutti d'un solo riscatto, in qualora, in qual parti del suolo.
Yeah, we get it, Fuller. But yeah, that the citing of the all men are created equal, with the consciousness that they didn't mean it as literally as she would have liked it at the time. Nonetheless, it remains a sort of like a message from the angels of where progress is headed. It's very fascinating to me. I don't know how self-conscious she is about that. There's another point where she uses, I think it's a biblical phrase, peace, peace, where there is no peace. That I don't know if you remember that, but I think it came up in the in Hope Leslie as well.
Oh, yeah.
And then I want to move a little bit further into the tail end of this part one here.
Up from the harangue to go into our closet and shut the door. There inquires the spirit, is this rhetoric the bloom of healthy blood, or a false pigment artfully laid on? And yet again we know where is so much smoke must be some fire. With so much talk about virtue and freedom must be mingled some desire for them. That it cannot be in vain that such have become the common topics of conversation among men, rather than schemes for tyranny and plunder, that the very newspapers see it best to proclaim themselves pilgrims, Puritans, heralds of holiness. The king that maintains so costly a retinue cannot be a mere boast or Carabas fiction. We have waited here long in the dust. We are tired and hungry. But the triumphal procession must appear at last. Of all its banners, none has been more steadily upheld, and under none have more valour and willingness for real sacrifices been shown, than that of the champions of the enslaved African. And this band it is, which partly from a natural following out of principles, partly because many women have been prominent in that cause, makes just now the warmest appeal in behalf of woman. Though there has been a growing liberality on this subject, yet society at large is not so prepared for the demands of this party, but that its members are, and will be for some time, coldly regarded as the Jacobins of their day. Is it not enough, cries the irritated trader, that you have done all you could to break up the national union, and thus destroy the prosperity of our country, but now you must be trying to break up family union, to take my wife away from the cradle and the kitchen hearth to vote at polls, and preach from a pulpit? Of course, if she does such things, she cannot attend to those of her own sphere. She is happy enough as she is. She has more leisure than I have, every means of improvement, every indulgence. Have you asked her whether she was satisfied with these indulgences? No, but I know she is. She is too amiable to desire what would make me unhappy, and too judicious to wish to step beyond the sphere of her sex. I will never consent to have our peace disturbed by any such discussions. Consent? You? It is not consent from you that is in question. It is assent from your wife. Am not I the head of my house? You are not the head of your wife. God has given her a mind of her own. I am the head, and she the heart. God grant you play true to one another then. I suppose I am to be grateful that you did not say she was only the hand. If the head repress no natural pulse of the heart, there can be no question as to your giving your consent. Both will be of one accord, and there needs but to present any question to get a full and true answer. There is no need of precaution, of indulgence, nor consent. But our doubt is whether the heart does consent with the head, or only obeys its decrees with a passiveness that precludes the exercise of its natural powers, or a repugnance that turns sweet qualities to bitter, or a doubt that lays waste the fair occasions of life. It is to ascertain the truth that we propose some liberating measures. Thus vaguely are these questions proposed and discussed at present. But their being proposed at all implies much thought, and suggests more. Many women are considering within themselves what they need that they have not, and what they can have if they find they need it. Many men are considering whether women are capable of being and having more than they are and have, and whether, if so, it will be best to consent to improvement in their condition. End of section 3.
Yeah, so I think just amazing. This is Woman in the 19th Century. You should read this. You should particularly download this Elizabeth Klett recording from Librivox. It's also available as a podcast if you search your podcast feed for it, the Klett version. Do you guys have any other parts of the you want to talk about?
It's kind of interesting that although she is very kind of sharp in her critique of marriage, and obviously she has an agenda there, she's very careful to point out that she's not being prescriptive. Like, she's not saying that all women need to choose not to get married and become a reformer like her. She's just saying people need to be free to be able to do what they like. In that respect, it's kind of like there's like a gentleness to her criticism, which is interesting.
And she also defends, on the other hand, spinsters. Basically, like lay off of them, basically.
Yeah. She's just saying, if you want to be like a nice wife, or if you want to be a spinster, that's cool. Let's just let everybody kind of fulfill their nature.
Right.
Yeah, she revels in the uniqueness of the average human being in a way that I think we all, America has played lip service to since its inception, but it's not really true for most thinkers. They usually just want some sort of uniform America, whereas Margaret Fuller is I want universal equality, and then from that I want this panoply of different souls that will spring forth from that.
Yeah. She did want fewer Irish immigrants.
Well, I mean...
Yeah.
Where is that?
It might have been in the Madison one. It wasn't a huge bailiwick for her, but she mentions it in poem. And there's another poem where she puts the words Americi into the into lower classes. You can't even say the name right. You're not living up to our. You're not living up to our Republican civic republicanism or whatever. So she, I mean. But in terms,
we can all co-sign on that. I think we're going to just dodge past that we can't just allow little anti-Irish sentiment.
Yeah, but I mean, look. Besides that, she's great. Here is this is from. So let's move on. Do we have anything more to say on women in the 21st century? Besides, check out the Klett version.
Yeah, there's just a couple grains I liked that just. Highlight one or two. She has this line: hypocrisy is the most hopeless as well as the meanest of crimes, and that those must surely be polluted by it who do not reserve part of their morality and religion for private use. And I love that phrase, that it's your religion and your morality are not private use.
Right.
And it has even greater meaning, I feel for today. It's actually a public good, your morality. And if you're not using it in the public sphere, it's the worst crime you can do.
Right. She publishes that, and then is where she really lifts off and leaves the Transcendentalists behind. From my part, she in 1846, when she's working for the Greeley Tribune, she denounces a war with Mexico. We'll get some quotes from her, but basically she sees it, recognized it at the time as they just want to expand slavery into Texas. Our good buddy Hawthorne felt differently.
That's shocking.
He said, it's not so much a calamity as others do, which is like...
Sorry.
That's okay. I mean, that is the conservative thing, right? Look at this. You got Mexican War derangement syndrome.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, it's never really dealing with, is it good or bad? It's just that the libs are overreacting.
Yeah. I wish we could live in a world without war too, but I'm also an adult.
This shit is the same. It's the same. Conservatism is the same throughout time.
And meanwhile, Thoreau is languishing in prison for like precisely one night because he refused to pay his taxes as a protest against the war before Emerson bails him out.
Right.
Which I just love.
Love those two boys. I just
we will do Emerson and Thoreau too. But I think Fuller, we get to Fuller first because she's the best of all of them.
She is the best.
But to tie it also with what you're saying with the Mexican American War is like when you talk about the liberal derangement syndrome or whatever, like it was about as unpopular to be against the Mexican American War as it was with like the invasion of Iraq.
Oh yeah,
that like especially if you were a public person, which is what made Lincoln so unique at that time when he was a legislator in Illinois, that he said it's a stupid war.
Hell yeah.
So like there's very few like another Illinois
president from
representative
Illinois,
who also waged war but not on his own people.
Yeah, exactly. The righteous war.
Continuing Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Kind of Syria.
That's very much our civil war.
Just to extend a little further, it's interesting that she saw that war as imperialist and that like she framed it in those terms and used that language. I wasn't aware that there were critiques like that happening at this point in the 19th century. Yeah,
it's weird that history sort of helps people forget that those were made coterminously.
Yeah.
Nobody, like all these people talking about the Iraq War, like, gosh, everybody got this wrong. No, there's a specific subset of people ideologically that did not get this wrong.
Biggest protest in the history of America.
People.
Yeah, exactly. The
and
biggest
in the UK.
Right,
well.
Yeah. People knew it was a fucking disaster. They just didn't have access to power.
I think kind of like what we're kind of jumping off from what you were saying, Grace, that it only underlines the tragedy of her premature death that much, that there were a number of people like her that were framing these issues as an imperialist or tying the imperialist project with the expansion of slavery directly. And these people wouldn't start like converging until like the mid 1850s in the formation of the Radical Republican Party. And I can only imagine what would have taken place had she been there for those years, basically.
Apparently she was due to take over the like chairwomanship of the convention that followed Seneca Falls in 1848.
Oh, really?
Like after she got back from America, she was going to take up this position.
Yeah, it was in the mail, right, waiting for her.
Yeah, it's really sad.
Yeah, okay, so just to go back, so in 1846, she denounces war with Mexico. Then she travels to Europe as the first female foreign correspondent. And it's not like it took that long, right? Foreign correspondents weren't a major thing. Journalism was like the height of new journalism, right? We talked about it in the Hans Pfaall episode. The early penny press.
And she kind of turned it into that, like, right? Like the idea, her chance to go to Europe came up first, and she was able to kind of bend it in. She was able to get her editor, Horace Greeley, on board with it.
Didn't she go as a tutor to it? Like, she couldn't afford to go on her own, so she like jumped at the chance to join this wealthier family as a tutor to that child. That's how she got to Europe.
Writing dispatches, just to basically top herself up.
It's the gig economy.
Yeah.
1840s.
Also shows what an incredible mentor Horace Greeley was, especially in comparison to Emerson.
Greeley, yeah, exactly.
Oh, he facilitated so much for her.
Well, he fucking paid her.
Yeah. I mean, he's like her only patron, basically.
And he paid her fairly because she negotiated a fair salary, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Marshall makes a point about that.
Okay, so I want to go back to my pal, and I've included a note card in there with the section we're going to play here. I want to play from Strange Nation, a book I've cited multiple times by J. Gerald Kennedy. And this goes in, it's the final section here, and it goes into basically Fuller traveling to Europe. She basically goes through the UK and then France and Italy, and gets more and more radical as that time goes on.
In a sense, Fuller's segmented narrative presents itself as a tale of three cities: London, Paris, and Rome, each representing a key phase in her radicalization. To be sure, many important events occurred elsewhere, yet these three fabled centers of culture each confronted her with vivid new instances of the social injustices that fueled revolutionary sentiment in Europe. These cities revealed different levels of unrest, forms of injustice, and strategies of opposition. In each, Fuller met powerful personalities who compelled her to see social reform in new ways and to gravitate toward armed resistance as the inevitable consequence of aristocratic and ecclesiastical tyranny over the common people. Throughout this radicalization, Fuller kept in mind her U.S. readers and recurrently viewed European events in the context of America's revolutionary nationhood. In an age of national revolutions, she positioned herself to interpret for her compatriots, caught in the toils of slavery and Western conquest, the US-Mexico War, the troubling American implications of the European struggle. Tracing the effects of the Continental Uprisings of 1848 on the writers of the American literary Renaissance, Reynolds has underscored the markedly different responses of Fuller and Emerson to the culture of revolution and the rise of republicanism, as well as socialism, in Europe. And while this contrast may be explained, as Reynolds notes, partly by the differing purposes of their travel, Emerson went abroad in 1847 to lecture and to find inspiration for new essays, it also seems clear that Fuller's sojourn produced a psychological and ideological break with Emerson, despite the continuation of a cordial correspondence. As Reynolds indicates, Emerson and Fuller had utterly different reactions to England, the former impressed by the country's power and prosperity, the latter dismayed by contrasting wealth and squalor. Emerging differences of sensibility led Fuller finally to reject two crucial tenets of Emersonian thought, the primacy of individualism and the ineffectiveness of cooperative reform efforts. Reynolds suggests that in Paris Fuller made a decisive turn toward the socialist thought that she fully embraced in Italy. But Fuller's London experience, it might be argued, made her receptivity to French social thought and her break with Emerson utterly inevitable. Fuller reached London only after a harrowing and portentous ordeal in Scotland, where she got lost in the mist and spent a cold night alone on the far side of Ben Lomond. After a brief recuperation, she resumed a journey that thereafter focused more on culture than nature, taking her to the great cities, where she contemplated the deformities of a social order fraught with oppression. Leaving the bucolic highlands, Fuller became increasingly absorbed by poverty and exploitation. In Glasgow she observed people, especially women, dressed in dirty, wretched tatters, and reflected ominously, need indeed is glaring throughout Scotland and England for the devoutest application of intellect and love to the cure of ills that cry aloud, and, without such application, must ere very long seek help by other means than words. She extracted from the architecture of Stirling Castle a moral about contemporary upstairs-downstairs relations of class difference. Still lords and ladies dance and sing above, unknowing or uncaring that the laborers who minister to their luxuries starve or are turned into wild beasts below. Having visited a coal mine at Newcastle and observed grimy steel workers at Sheffield, Fuller felt relieved to reach London after the season, thereby sparing herself the most blatant contrast between the pomp and parade of wealth and luxury and the misery, squalid, agonizing, ruffianly, which stares one in the face in every street of London. She pitted.
I just want to point out, this reminds me a lot of George Orwell's
Yes.
journey. Check out the, if you're a patron, you'll have access to the special series we're doing on George Orwell, Orweller. But this reminds me of his sort of coming up for air slash, or not coming up for air, not eastbound and down, down and out in Paris and London, and road to Wigan Pier sort of thing.
She pitied the poor but claimed to pity even more the English noble faced with social problems requiring a speedy solution. Repeatedly she intimated that only immediate reform in England could avert revolutionary violence. In London, Fuller also discovered encouraging signs of progress: the founding of the People's Journal, an organ of enlightened social and political opinion, Drive Southwood Smith's construction of habitable lodging for working class people, the model prison at Pentonville, which still fell short of her high expectations, a combined public bath and public laundry for the indigent, and a school for poor Italian boys, run by Joseph Mazzini and other Italian exiles. As important to her as the organs and institutions of reform were the great-souled individuals whom she encountered. Fuller traveled to Hampstead to pay homage to Joanna Baillie, whom she classed with the French feminist Madame Roland as women of a Spartan, Roman strength and singleness of mind. She likewise met Mary and William Howitt, editors of the People's Journal, as well as Thomas Cooper, the poet who had spent 2 years in prison for advocating universal male suffrage. Mazzini, however, was by far the most beauteous person with whom Fuller became acquainted in London. He personified the cause of human freedom, and in his heroism, courage, and wisdom, Fuller perceived an almost holy devotion to the cause of republicanism. Expelled from Italy in 1831, Mazzini had learned French and English to build support for young Italy and his dream of a unified nation. His example aroused Fuller's interest in the struggle unfolding in Italy. He seemed the harbinger of a better era in Europe at large. Significantly, Mazzini appealed to a global vision of human rights and freedoms, to a political consciousness that transcended mere national advantages. Fuller had already been planning to visit Italy to observe the impending social drama. Mazzini fired her passion for the cause. Fuller's unpleasant encounters with Thomas Carlyle also fueled.
So Mazzini is a very important figure, but I like this part here where she sort of outgrows Emerson by noticing one of his influences in the conservative Thomas Carlyle.
Fuller's unpleasant encounters with Thomas Carlyle also fueled her sense of social justice, and because Emerson had so extolled the great man, her disillusionment was probably inevitable. In her Tribune profile she wrote appreciatively of Carlyle's intellectual candor: "He has torn off the veils from hideous facts, he has burnt away foolish illusions," but she found him personally insufferable, a man incapable of conversation because unwilling to listen to anyone but himself. In Carlyle she confronted in arrogant and overbearing form that skepticism about collective social action that had troubled her in Emerson. Indeed, on her third exposure to Carlyle's harangue, Fuller took umbrage at his attack on democracy, progress, and reform as Rosewater imbecilities, a dismissal the more repugnant to her because it trivialized the gallant work of Mazzini, who was among Fuller's guests and whose mild protest Carlyle quashed. Because Emerson had identified so closely with Carlyle, editing his work for U.S. publication and virtually becoming, as Robert D. Richardson remarks, his American agent, Fuller must have recognized in Carlyle's torrential ridicule of social and political action the root of Emerson's mistrust of collectivism. Carlyle's boorish treatment of Mazzini, with whom he claimed friendship, epitomized his failure to comprehend the significance and urgency of the revolutionary movement then threatening to reorder Europe. Although publications such as the People's Journal and people like the Howitts sustained Fuller's faith that social injustices might be alleviated by progressive efforts, contact with arch-conservatives like Carlyle and recurrent scenes of abject poverty in England awakened a belief that charitable deeds and lofty phrases were insufficient to transform a traditionary, class-bound society. In France, she discovered a similar, shocking disparity between the affluent beneficiaries of Louis Philippe's bourgeois monarchy and Les Miserables. Gratified by the discovery that the French had, in the creation of the state-run crèche, anticipated the need for daycare that would allow mothers to enter the workforce, Fuller found several other institutions of social reform in Paris: a night school for workers run by the Christian Brothers, A place called Les Diaconesses where women could find shelter, daycare, and medical attention for sick children, and the school for idiots, where she wept sweet and bitter tears at the tender care bestowed on the tragically impaired little ones. But the winter of 1846–47 had inflicted great suffering on the poorer classes in France, primarily through food shortages, and the government had suppressed radical publications that sought to expose social ills. Underestimating its imminence, Fuller predicted a future uprising, while Louis-Philippe Lives, the gases, compressed by his strong grasp, may not burst up to light, but the need of some radical measures of reform is not less strongly felt in France than elsewhere, and the time will come before long when such will be imperatively demanded. In fact, the revolutionary flame would ignite Paris less than a year after her departure. What Fuller saw in France convinced her that the utopian socialism articulated by Charles Fourier had taken root, and she lamented the resistance of Americans to a frank discussion of systematic injustices in the United States. The more I see of the terrible ills which infest the body politic of Europe, the more indignation I feel at the selfishness or stupidity of those in my own country who oppose an examination of these subjects such as is animated by the hope of prevention. She became convinced of the need for radical measures of reform if not outright revolution by her contact in Paris with several powerful personalities who advocated socialist principles, the priest and activist Félicité Robert Delaunay, the novelist George Sand, and the Polish revolutionary and poet Adam Mickiewicz. Kennedy continued.
So yeah, that's before she gets to Italy. Before she gets to Italy, she's meeting all these people. George Sand, the famous author, who Proust was a big fan of. It was an influence on her there. And we'll close it out with a little bit more from Strange Nation, where Fuller goes full socialist.
In late November, about the time she became pregnant, she composed a dispatch, published on New Year's Day, 1848, filled with reflections on the incendiary situation in Europe and the aggravating indifference of her fellow Americans. Concealing her own Italianization, she commended foreign travel as an reaffirmation of national identity. The American in Europe, if a thinking mind, can only become more American, and then proceeded to place American travelers in three categories, two of which, the servile American and the conceited American, indicated her scorn, manifested elsewhere in the Tribune dispatches, for the generality of her compatriots abroad. For readers at home she summarized the oppressive conditions in England, France, Poland, Italy, Russia, and Austria, portraying a continent on the brink of upheaval. All things bode and declare a new outbreak of the fire, to destroy old palaces of crime. Against the image of a coming European revolution, she evoked the American national struggle that produced a democratic republic based on the inborn rights of men, but addressing the national symbol, she vehemently denounced America's recent lapses. Yet, O eagle, how often dost thou near the ground, how show the vulture in these later days? Thou wert to be the advance guard of humanity, the herald of all progress, how often hast thou betrayed this high commission? She acknowledged that Americans enjoyed freedom of the press, an effective governmental system of checks and balances, and broad opportunity for talent to rise. But reaching a pitch of patriotic anger, Fuller delivered her most sustained critique of the failures and hypocrisies of her own nation. Here she captures a disturbing strangeness. But dare I say that political ambition is not as darkly sullied as in other countries? Must I not confess in my country to a boundless lust of gain? Must I not confess to the weakest vanity, which bristles and blusters at each foolish taunt of the foreign press, and must I not admit that the men who make these undignified rejoinders seek and find popularity so? Must I not confess that there is as yet no antidote cordially adopted that will defend even that great, rich country against the evils that have grown out of the commercial system in the old world? Then there is this horrible cancer of slavery, and this wicked war, that has grown out of it. I find the cause of tyranny and wrong everywhere the same and low. My country the darkest offender, because with the least excuse, forsworn to the high calling with which she was called, no champion of the rights of men, but a robber and a jailer, the scourge hid behind her banner, her eyes fixed, not on the stars, but on the possessions of other men. as she witnessed the desperate bid by Republican forces in Europe to overthrow the aristocracy and to found new nations based on human rights and freedoms, Fuller decried not only the apathy of her countrymen to the crisis across the Atlantic but also their relentless, unacknowledged betrayal of the founding precepts of liberty and equality as well as their equally unconfessed surrender to greed and rapacity. Mindful of American resistance to criticism, she added, "I do not know what I have written, but something of true love must be in these lines." Fuller's patriotic love of country urges her to condemn its nationalistic sins. As Jeffrey Steele notes, Fuller meant to rejuvenate her country, and she saw voluntary association or socialist reform as the necessary means to correct homegrown injustices. But the brunt of her dispatch is a denunciation of outrages, the extension of slavery, the taking of Mexican land and property committed in the name of American manifest destiny. Within weeks of the column's publication, revolutionary change engulfed Italy and much of Europe. The Milanese protested Austrian rule by boycotting heavily taxed tobacco, Sicilians demonstrated against King Ferdinand, the despised ruler of Naples, nervous Italian monarchs began to grant constitutions, the French deposed Louis Philippe, Austria revolted against Prince Metternich, and Germany moved toward federation. Caught between supporters of a unified Italy and Austrian invaders, the Pope refused to declare war against another Catholic country, rejected republicanism, and became a target of opposition in Rome, finally fleeing the Vatican. During the tumultuous year of insurrections, Fuller wrote little as she anguished about her fate. She confided to Emerson in December that she wanted to go to sleep, and be born again. Without mentioning her pregnancy, she told Caroline Sturgis Tappan in January 1848 that she was entering upon a sphere of her destiny so difficult that she could see no way out, except through the gate of death. In March, with the onset of the heavy rain, the arrival of Michios in Rome provided some relief from the pressure of secrecy. Fuller confided her predicament to him and considered asking him to be the child's godfather. He told Fuller about dramatic events in Paris and offered perspectives that she would incorporate into her dispatch of March 29, recapitulating for Tribune readers key events in Italy and then commenting on the fall of Louis Philippe's government in Paris. She exhorted Americans to grasp the meaning of the social clash in France. You may learn the real meaning of the words fraternity, equality. You may, despite the apes of the past, who strive to tutor you, learn the needs of a true democracy. You may in time learn to reverence, learn to guard, the true aristocracy of a nation, the only really noble the laboring classes. Yeah. In this phase of her radicalization, Fuller, influenced by Michios, increasingly came to see the national revolutions of Europe in terms of a class struggle between common workers and an aristocracy propped up by the bourgeoisie. If the United States hoped to achieve a true democracy, she now believed, it must honor the laboring classes as indispensable to the idea of an American nation. Her sense of alienation impelled her remark in the dispatch of April 19, "My country is at present spoiled by prosperity, stupid with the lust of gain, soiled by crime in its willing perpetuation of slavery, shamed by an unjust war, noble sentiment much forgotten even by individuals, the aims of politicians selfish or petty, the literature frivolous and venal." She professed that she had no desire to come home and now saw her role as becoming the historian of the revolution in Italy.
She actually would write a history of the revolution in Italy that would be lost when her boat sank 50 to 100 yards off of the coast of Fire Island. Putting dark irony to the "let them be sea captains" comment in Women in the 19th Century, because apparently, if memory serves, the original pilot of that boat got sick and died in Spain, and so they had to have a replacement. And yeah, it hit some rocks and she perished.
She also, at the end of Women in the 19th Century, she quotes, I think, Shakespeare, and says, "Though many have suffered shipwreck, still beat noble hearts," which is eerie. Again. Yeah. So many shipwreck motifs.
And she had a dream about drowning
yes.
too. Yeah, a lot of presentiments there. I think we covered one of the most interesting lives we've covered so far.
Interesting.
Anything else you guys want to add about Margaret Fuller? I'll just add quickly. Buckminster Fuller, the technologist / architect. I'm not terribly familiar with his output, but is the great-grand-nephew of Margaret Fuller.
There's a nice little moment that Megan Marshall covers in her biography after the ship sank, where Emerson sent Thoreau out to attempt to find the manuscript,
right,
and any other papers for her, because Horace Greeley had decided that we need to make like a monument to her as quick as possible before she vanishes from the national consciousness.
Smart.
Yeah, and there's this lovely moment where Thoreau doesn't find anything, essentially. But
finds a button from Gianni Assoli's jacket.
Yeah. So it says, precious letters from Mazzini and Menkowitz. What's that?
Miscovich.
Miscovich survived, along with Margaret's correspondence with Giovanni and a slim journal she kept in Rome during the early months of 1849, ending just as the siege began. Nothing more. Nothing until Thoreau stumbled across Giovanni's guardsman coat. He ripped off one button and pocketed it for his return to Concord. It so stupidly mocked his quest after vanished lives. Quote, held up, he would write of the button in his diary, quote, it intercepts the light and casts a shadow, an actual button so-called, and yet all the life it is connected with is less substantial to me than my faintest dreams.
Man. Yeah. So Margaret Fuller, the goat. Best, I mean, we have a lot of goats.
Yeah.
She is goat, though. I have one little anecdote, Matt. The also from the Marshall biography that Alex was just quoting from. After she died, although her body was lost, they put a little memorial stone up for her in Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is also where I think Henry James and William James are buried, and a bunch of other literary figures. It's a really cool cemetery if people have a chance to check it out. Anyway, they put this memorial stone up, I think it was up a hill or something, because it's a huge cemetery. And within a few years, it had become the most visited place in the cemetery, that a path was actually trodden up towards it. And that path became the first paved road in the cemetery. So, kind of cool that she, attracted a devoted following even after death.
She needs to be much more prominent in our culture.
So much more. Yeah. I was just saying to Alex, it's extraordinary to me that she is not mentioned in the same breath as Emerson and Thoreau consistently.
Oh, absolutely. I was going to say, she should be mentioned anytime you bring up, Wollstonecraft and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But definitely more than the other... The real transcendentalists.
Yeah.
I don't know. I downloaded some of Emerson's essays, and I mean he's an interesting and engaging writer, but he didn't do anything like this.
It's the cultivation of that thought. It's bringing that transcendentalist energy towards some sort of material purpose.
Right. It's not pointless.
Yes.
And that's the thing I like about her conversations. It's I forget how she formulated it, but she tries to bring women to to think about what do I want to do and how do I want to do it, or what needs to be done, and not just let's think about ideas and let's talk about the Greeks and stuff like that. It's excellent. So
in the Vivian Gornick review of the biography,
Matson,
the Matson, she was saying that basically what happens when Fuller goes to Europe is she moves from the transcendentalist conception of self-improvement to this concept of reform. And I think that's very much like what you were saying, Alex, that she kind of takes what Emerson implants and then applies it to the world.
Yeah.
And it's very inspiring.
There's something to circle it to the book that's touching about what you said about her grave being the first paved road, or the path to her grave being the first paved road, because she refers to the great women in history and herself as fellow pilgrims on the well-made road.
Well, Alex and Grace.
On that note.
Yeah,
I think
we got to get out of here.
That was so much fun.
Yeah, this is a good episode. I mean, they're all good, but this is a very good episode. Feel good about this one. Margaret Fuller, the woman who transcended the Transcendentalist into socialism. That's the hierarchy. You got individualist, transcendentalism, and you got socialism.
Socialism, yeah, the three great isms.
It's better than that. Okay.
If she did it, America can definitely do it.
She did it in 40 years, less than 40 years.
Yeah, she had a lot of life in her short life. And yeah, there's one part, I forget this quote, but she's like, I've met everyone in America and no one impresses me. So she was just a boss. Literary Hangover, we're at 191 patrons. Zooming up there.
We're gonna knock out the Dial's readership pretty soon.
Literally, I think about this in this terms of that. I mean, we already get more listeners than probably well, it's hard to say because the thing about newsprint at this time is it was shared a whole lot. So like 30 people might have read one issue of it. But that said, I bet the average Literary Hangover episode is doing better than the average Dial publication at this point.
Matt, I think we should have a patron spin-off called Conversations in honor of Margaret Fuller.
I think that wouldn't be a bad idea.
Maybe women only.
I mean, I'll support that. I can't be a part of it, I guess. So check that out. Coming up soon is probably next. We're going to do for the Orweller series, just for patrons. We're going to do Such Were the Joys. Talk about George Orwell at St. Cyprian's Preparatory Academy, or Crossgates, as he calls it. And then I'm not sure what we're going to do. We'll have some other things. Chris and I are going to do Rutger Bregman's Utopia for Realists, and probably get into the weeds about UBI a little bit, and we might get into some Fenimore Cooper. I'm not sure. We're
a throwback. We're closing in on the 1 year mark for you, right?
That's true. Actually, I don't know if we'll have another episode up before we reach a year. So this and the next one are sort of the 1 year anniversary episodes.
Yeah.
So it's been great, actually. I'm very proud of the work we've done so far. I thank you both for the work you've put into this. So thanks again, Alex and Grace. I'll put their Twitter handles in the show notes this time.
Yep. The one thing everyone should know is that it's easy for us and we don't have any notes in front of us.
Yeah.
It just comes right off the dome.
Yeah, and you shouldn't try unless you can do that extemporaneously as good as we can. Yeah, exactly. Absolutely no research went into this episode at all.
No, we picked the topic right before we started recording.
I didn't read two massive biographies.
I didn't tramp the fells of the Lake District listening to an audiobook about Margaret Fuller for literally 25 hours.
Yeah, pleasant though.
Yeah, very nice.
With that said, thank you very much, listeners. We will see you again next time.